English translation 701st contact Thursday, the 1st of February 2018, 21:48 hours.
Ptaah, I was not expecting you until Saturday, but be welcome and greetings, dear friend.
I also greet you, Edward, my dear friend. It is a pleasure to see you well, for as Njana has told me, your health has not been good. And the reason I am coming now is that I will be unavailable on Saturday, the 3rd of February, and so I am coming to see you just before your birthday. Of course, apart from that, I also want to talk to you privately and also answer all the questions you have asked Njana and Florina to photograph and to pass on to me as questions.
Yes, I had a high fever that kept me from working for 3 days. But now everything is all right again. And somehow it turned out that, as with the stroke, strange headaches attacked me again, which had the effect that I can suddenly look straight again without seeing everything twice. Only when my eyes are tired or I look to the right, left, or upwards do I still see everything twice. But it is good that you are here so that we can clarify everything. And also what Quetzal has already informed me about in relation to the foreign distorting influence in the 697th contact conversation, which I had called up and written down. What I would be interested in first, however, is the matter that relates to your 52,000 year piece. Quetzal has already enlightened me that there is an error in the old contact conversation reports that no one has noticed for all the time since I retrieved and wrote down the conversations. But I would now like you to clarify the matter.
I want to do that. After we had gone through the corresponding old conversation reports according to your questions to Njana and Florina, and checked them against the original conversation records, which we had not done before, we came across some serious mistakes that had probably crept in during the retrieval, transcription, and editing of the reports. In the 60th contact conversation, for example, a misleading mistake was made, which you have to correct by replacing the before with after in the conversation with my daughter Simyase in sentence 14, many millennia before the establishment of peace, because it should correctly read many millennia after the establishment of tranquility, peace, and freedom.
Good, for that, according to Quetzal, I have prescribed this in the computer, and I can correct it, which I will do in a moment. One moment, please.
60th contact, Thursday, the 8th of July, 1976, 14:03 hours.
Some 150,000 Earth years ago, our homeworlds finally found peace and freedom after a very long time of wars and uprisings.
Correction. Many millennia before equals false after the establishment of peace, tranquility, and freedom. However, the scientist named Pelagon made himself the leader of a group comprising some 70,000 human beings, with the help of which he seized several large ships and fled.
That is good and correct. Then you can equally correct the next error, picking out the 369th conversation report.
Just a moment, I will have that in a moment. Just a moment, yes, here. I have got it, and I will copy it out in a moment. Which sentence do you want it to be?
The 105th, in which the number 1136 is wrong, because the correct number is 101,036, after omitting the 2 zeros that give a time of 101,036 years.
Good, I will also do that right away. Here, I have the report, and I will correct the wrong number to the correct one.
369th contact, Friday, the 12th of November, 2004, 2:08 hours.
Correction. The whole process of reason took 1,136 equals false 101,036 years, but then everything was sealed.
This is also correct now, but you still have to open the 237th conversation report and correct the statement millions of years with tens of thousands of years in sentence 60.
Yes, there I have it. Then I will copy the whole thing out right here to have the context.
237th contact, Friday, the 9th of November, 1990, 23:17 hours.
What you are telling me is known to me, and I know that at that time, peace was actually created through this measure. But the human beings became effeminate in the course of time and abolished the army of multinational form. So soon again, wars swept over the worlds, and power-hungry people rose to the governments.
Correction, this lasted for tens of thousands of years before the same system was introduced again 52,000 years ago by the multinational peacekeeping force. After that it took 67 years, after which peace actually prevailed everywhere again, which has remained until today, not least because of the multinational peacekeeping force which has been an integral part of our entire federation ever since. Weapons may only be manufactured for this force and for recreational purposes, although hunting and killing animals of all kinds is prohibited, as is unfortunately not the case on Earth. Animals may only be shot in our federation in self-defense or when they are harmful to the environment.
Then all the errors have now been corrected.
Thanks. And so I think it is now clear that after the first peace was made some 150,000 years ago, through the machinations of the scientist Pelagon, renewed warfare broke out and lasted for a long time.
This is correct, because the exact number of years that my daughter Simya-se had given as the first time of peace in sentence 13 as about 150,000 Earth years ago was in reality little more than 153,000 years. The warfare triggered by Pelagon then lasted again for a very long time, 101,036 years, after which a peace lasting until today could finally be established 52,000 years ago.
Hopefully that should clear everything up now. Unfortunately, we are not immune to spelling mistakes, even though we do the best we can in our series of corrections. And the fact that I also make mistakes when retrieving the conversation reports, that is of course my fault.
You cannot be blamed for that either, because all of you, who do the best you can and edit the written works and finish them up to print, starting with you, who call up and write down the conversation reports in a very strenuous way, through those who deal with the correction work several times, in which you are also involved, as well as Bernadette, who is in charge of the final work to get them ready for print, have always been overloaded with all the work.
That is unfortunately the case, and we cannot find anyone who has the necessary knowledge and also the interest to take part in this work. So we have had concerns for a long time about what will be and what will become with everything in terms of paperwork and correcting when we bless our temporal.
We are also concerned about that because we also do not know a solution to it till date.
So it would be futile to talk about it further.
Unfortunately, that is really the case. Then I want to address the next issue, which relates to the malicious foreign interference with your writing in your computer.
Excuse me, because I have something to say about that. And that is that on the one hand, when I edit and compile the Zeitzeichen, there is also interference from somewhere, and suddenly various articles are shifted, torn apart, and put together incorrectly. And on the other hand, these and other things have also been happening at Bernadette's for months, making our work more difficult.
Which of course can be related to all other foreign interventions. But what is to be said now regarding the foreign interventions in your computer is the following. As you know, Zafanat Paneach and Yanarara have been monitoring your computer for months and have repeatedly detected extraneous irregularities. Unfortunately, in the last few months, this monitoring has revealed that these extraneous influences have increased, whereby a multiple check of the 697th contact conversation from the 17th of December 2017 revealed 3 times extraneous serious falsifying changes as well as large text omissions. In the case of these foreign manipulations, Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach could directly observe the influences and see how the texts changed without being able to do anything about it and without being able to determine how and from where these influences occurred. That there were insertions into the report from unknown sources. As Zafanat Paniach and Yanarara were able to determine is therefore beyond doubt, because this is what the checks of your computer records over several months have shown. This is proven by the very precise checks that have been carried out with regard to your records for months. However, your records that you process and work on for us are not affected by this, because they are directly retrieved and consequently not stored in the computer. But it is interesting that just at the time of the checks, it turned out that on the original page, 5,123 at the 697th conversation report in an unknown and strange way, uncontrollable written inserts were inserted into your retrieved and already existing conversation text and changed and falsified the given sense of the text. However, I have now brought you the relevant part of the conversation again, which my father gave you in 1945, and which you can then insert into the original report.
Note, the omission and falsification in the 697th contact report involves a total of 21 sentences that were deleted by unknown influences and replaced by a new, maliciously falsified text. Furthermore, sentence 150 appears twice, also as sentence 154, while sentence 151 is also doubled, thus sentence 155, which has then also been falsified. The omissions and falsifications in the 697th contact report thus concern sentences 151 to 157. From sentence 158 onwards, which is repeated in Ptaah's correction as sentence 173, fourth S text is then correctly reproduced again.
Further, it will emerge as explained that the member states of this dictatorship are egregiously exploited by large financial contributions. The whole thing will also apply to Switzerland if, as a result of the ignorance, unreasonableness, and irresponsibility of leading responsible rulers and the ignorant part of the people, the repressive demands of the Union dictatorship are advocated. As a result, Switzerland and its people will be financially exploited and harassed and deprived of independence by Union dictatorship laws and creeping and insidious dictatorial rules, decrees, and regulations. And this will happen if uninformed or dictatorship-friendly negotiating country leaders, as well as the uninformed part of it, the people, allow themselves to be blinded by the dictatorship rulers, and they will submit to the insidious demands of the Union dictatorship against the will of the thoughtful and reasonable Swiss people by means of anti-freedom resolutions, unfair treaties, and coercion. Only if the people of Switzerland oppose these actions of those responsible but irresponsible rulers by means of popular resolutions, who in their ignorance allow themselves to be deceived by the rulers of the dictatorship, can it be prevented that Switzerland will become a servile vassal state of this Union dictatorship. But if those responsible for the country and the unreasonable part of the people will not be attentive and allow themselves to be deceived by the dictatorship despotism, then it will inevitably happen that, as will happen among many peoples throughout the world, through the work of America, an extremely unpeaceful state will develop between this Europe-encompassing dictatorship and Switzerland. And it would become, if Switzerland should negligently and recklessly yield to the dictatorship, that the neutrality of the country, as well as its peace and freedom, would be as seriously damaged as it would be in respect of its population. If this should really happen, then, on the instructions of the Union dictatorship, the freedom of information, opinion, and the press would finally be restricted, just as the dictatorial machinations would also infiltrate the order and laws of Switzerland and make it compulsorily a servile vassal state. In addition, the freedom of information, which will be guaranteed by law in the future, as well as the Swiss governmental duty to inform, would be suppressed and prevented in such a way that the population would no longer be informed about certain actions, treaties and machinations, etc., in connection with the Union dictatorship, but everything would be handled and controlled secretly by the government. And this would happen in the same way as will be the case early on in the administration of the Union dictatorship itself, which on the one hand will make secret machinations, and on the other hand will deceive the countries and populations of its Union dictatorship and bring them under its direct thumb in every respect. And if Switzerland should be affected by this, then discord and dissatisfaction would break out among the Swiss people and possibly disturb the peace and freedom in the country to such an extent that a nationwide resistance could result and lead to civil war. And it would be as it was when in 1918 a nationwide domestic crisis threatened and the Federal Council deployed the army of more than 100,000 soldiers equipped with machine weapons to proceed unhesitatingly with vicious violence against the striking population and to accept many deaths if the nationwide strike could not have been broken off and the people forced to capitulate with threats. But as in the coming times and in the new millennium, there will be no real peace and no true freedom in the whole world. But war threats and acts of war will again and again intimidate and frighten mankind. The old traditional delusion of the power-obsessed and the mass of the ignorant in the peoples will continue to exist against all reason and rationality. Also in the third millennium, as in the past, the danger of warmongering will emanate particularly strongly from the United States of America, which will create strife and unfreedom worldwide and will try to bring more and more countries of the earth under its absolute control. And it will then be further that, through the machinations of the Union dictatorship, Switzerland will suffer damage to its neutrality and its population will fall more and more into discord and unfreedom, as the dictatorship will try ever more insidiously, harshly, and bullyingly, and slowly, compellingly, to drive the country into its clutches. And if the Swiss people and their responsible rulers were not vigilant enough and allowed themselves to be deceived and maneuvered into the clutches of dictatorship, then a creeping loss of sovereignty would take hold in Switzerland, as well as an increasingly clear dependence on the Union dictatorship, which is becoming more and more compelling. The fact will be, however, that their sense of power will spread very quickly throughout Europe and will therefore also include Switzerland. Then it will also come about if those responsible for the country and the sensible part of the population do not remember freedom and peace, do not defend themselves against the dictatorial demands and measures of the dictatorship and do not reject them, that in the course of time the Union dictatorship, which is developing ever more totalitarian, will deceitfully mislead Switzerland and its population with lies and deceit and integrate them into the dictatorship. So it is to be warned once again that the whole thing will also apply to Switzerland if, as a result of the ignorance unreasonableness and irresponsibility of leading governments responsible for negotiating with the dictatorship, and of that ill-advised part of the people who will flirt thoughtlessly with the dictatorship. The repressive demands of the Union dictatorship should be obeyed. In this way, Switzerland and its people would be financially exploited and steadily more harassed and deprived of independence by Union dictatorship laws, as well as by its rules, ordinances, and regulations. This would be the case if the uninformed people in charge of the negotiations and the uninformed part of the people were to be blinded by the Union dictatorship, and if, against the will of the people, they were to submit to the insidious demands of the Union dictatorship by means of anti-freedom resolutions, unfair contracts, and coercion. Only if the Swiss people oppose these actions of those responsible but irresponsible rulers who negotiate with the dictatorship by means of popular resolutions can it be prevented in the coming third millennium that Switzerland ends up as a vassal state of the Union dictatorship. So, as in the whole world, if Switzerland and its population do not act with reason and rationality against the unfreedom and subjugating demands and underhandedness of the Union dictatorship, an unpeaceful state of affairs will also develop in Switzerland between it, the Swiss population, and the dictatorship.
This, Edward, you must now insert in the original text and thereby correct the whole. And what Yanarara and Zafanat would like me to tell you about this kind of unpleasant occurrence is that both of them are trying very hard to find ways and means to prevent these malicious interventions, textual damages and textual falsifications, etc. However, they have not yet been able to bring the energies and forces responsible for this under control, just as they have not yet been able to find the origin of the interventions caused by Earth humans, which are consciously and maliciously controlled and falsified in relation to religious, sectarian, and political facts via the energy network into your computer and into your writing. Unfortunately, the energy grid cannot be blocked, because on the one hand you need it for the operation of your apparatuses and devices, and on the other hand, Zafanat Paneach and Yanarara have not yet found a possibility for a security filtering, by which external interferences with your computer and your writing work operated by the energy grid could be stopped or even completely prevented.
Crazy, the whole falsification and text emission thing. This is really steep, huge, and the hammer. And I seem to remember that I recalled and wrote down all that you have now repeated from your father Svath's statements shortly after our conversation on the 17th of December last year.
But which was erased from the conversation report by the malicious foreign interference in your computer and changed 3 times by a short line falsification.
Monstrous, but no one is buying that, nor do they understand it. Bernadette and I, who are living and experiencing the whole thing, well, some people will probably think we are barmy and crazy. And so I will also be seen as...
What is this? Where do these things fall on your work table from?
Oh, I was just going to talk to you about that. Maybe my thoughts were the trigger that this is happening right now, as you are sitting next to it. What has just now fallen down on the table from the brighter light corresponds to the same phenomenon to which these 6 pieces of money, the ring, and the little rose here under the monitor also belong. And these things here, they are pieces of jewelry, as you see, and which astonish you because they fell on the table in front of me, obviously also belong to the other pieces that I have under the monitor. I have already told you several times that from time to time pieces of money etc. simply fall in front of me on my desk, as I have just done now, since you were able to observe it yourself. Somehow the things must materialize directly in front of my face and fall onto the table, because if they were to fall from a higher place, such as from the lamp, then they would probably fly through the area because they would bounce strongly from a great height and be flung away. So I do not think they can materialize more than 15-20 centimeters in front of my face at the most and fall onto the table. Look here. Now my collection has increased by 2 small cut gemstones, a tiny red stone and a larger green stone, another ring with a cut light stone and 2 different brooches. Consequently, I now have 13 such objects. Wait, this one I put on a paper handkerchief, so now you can admire it better.
On the paper handkerchief are the 5 objects that materialized in front of Billy in the presence of Ptaah and fell down on his desk. Around them are the 8 objects that fell at various times before the 1st of February 2018.
Strange, something like what has just happened, which I have just seen and experienced myself, is incomprehensible to me. You have probably told me about it several times, and also let me see the coins, the ring, and the little rose, but I have not given it any serious thought. But the fact that I was able to witness such an occurrence myself not only amazes me, but astounds me, and could almost make me doubt my sanity and reason. In this way, as it happens, and with nothing discernible just how, from where, and why it happens, the whole thing is absolutely puzzling and inexplicable to me.
It is to me too, but I have long since given up trying to fathom these events. On the one hand, I have come to the realization that this phenomenon will remain one for me and that I will probably not be able to solve the riddle connected with it. On the other hand, I do not want to get carried away and drive myself crazy, which is why I simply regard the whole thing as a mystery, and this as unsolvable, and therefore do not think about it any further.
You can do that, which is probably also correct from your point of view, but which will probably also be the case for me, because I have actually never seen, experienced, or witnessed anything similar during my entire life, and have therefore never been confronted with such an occurrence despite my diverse knowledge, experiences. Consequently, I have also never been able to deal with anything of this kind, which is why I can also find no explanation for what has happened now. The truth is that I also now lack an explanation in every respect, and the whole thing is absolutely incomprehensible and inexplicable to me.
Exactly. So we both resign ourselves to it, although there must be an explanation for it, which we cannot find, at least now. There must be an explanation for these occurrences that is clear, but in order to find it, we would have to have certain knowledge that could introduce us to this mysterious matter. We can certainly form ideas and also make assumptions, but the extent to which these will then be compatible with reality is certainly extremely questionable. Consequently, precisely because we lack this knowledge, it is better, at least from my point of view, not to want to get to the bottom of the matter, so as not to draw the wrong conclusions or get carried away. However, should relevant findings emerge over time that would allow us to reflect and hypothesize, then it would still be early enough to want to get to the bottom of the mystery or enigma.
Clearly and logically thought out and stated in a brief explanatory manner with which I can also show solidarity.
It is an honor, thanks. Talking too much about it would be pointless, and would only make ridiculous any knowledge of who we are, as I wrote 3 years ago for a certain reason with the following aphorism or aphorism.
Talking too much makes you ridiculous. Some human beings talk too much, and do not notice how they make their fellow human beings weary, tired, uninterested, and inattentive. They themselves like to hear their voices too much, find their torrent of words casual and clever, and do not notice how they make themselves ridiculous with it. Simyase Silver Star Center, December 13, 2015, 10:12 HRS, Billy.
This aphorism is in reference to those who constantly talk ill-advisedly, constantly butting into other people's conversations, not realizing that their stupid interjections are not wanted, and they thereby make themselves unpopular with those around them, thereby not making friends, but only creating enemies and antipathy towards themselves, not realizing that they are outing themselves as thoughtless, naive, clueless, bloody stupid, and stupendous in making fools of themselves. This, while others, through much stupid, primitive, and inflammatory talk, evoke such hostility that vicious conflicts and confrontations, murder, manslaughter, hatred, and wars arise from it, as is the case with the USA, which is obsessed with world domination. This, however, can no longer be called ridiculous, but only absolutely idiotic and irresponsible. Some time ago, as in our last private conversation, we talked again about the fact that the madmen in the U.S. government, in the U.S. military, and other anomalies are eager to provoke not only Russia, but also China in order to involve them in political, military, and warlike conflicts and to be able to direct them in the U.S. manner. And in this regard, you said on the 17th of December last year that the USA is already building up its aggressiveness against Russia and China again to a greater extent, in a way that will cause Russia and China to protest and create dangerous situations. You said that new nuclear weapon systems or something like that will play an important role and will cause protests. But the whole thing of these protests is deliberately planned by the delusional people in the government and military, etc. of the USA. But the people are not being informed correctly.
That is correct. And these reprehensible machinations are already underway in such a way that they are now reaching the world public and will of course cause Russia and China to protest, which, as has now also been mentioned by you, has been calculated in advance by those responsible in the USA, who have planned everything. The whole of this is now so far advanced that it is beginning to spread openly and will do its effects, which will be unpleasant.
As usual, alas. The madness of warmongering by the USA continues unchecked as it always has, with the whole world simply letting everything happen and not moving because they say nothing against the USA and do not want to jeopardize their relations of dependence with them. It must also be said in this context that the Cold War has also been going on again for some time now, of course triggered again by the USA, as was the case after the last World War. Even if this is still not publicly admitted, but it has been a fact again for some time and is once again threatening the entire world. There has also been a lot of rearmament for years, with the delusion of a balance of arms in the foreground, through which the dubious and unreal peace is to be maintained, which in reality does not exist, and consequently the whole rearmament and balance of arms corresponds to a farce and an absolutely imbecilic, insane and pathologically insane way of thinking. Through arming and a weapon equilibrium only ongoing fear, hatred, strife and war madness are created, but nothing is ever built into peace, and neither is it maintained. Because if fear, strife, and war madness exist, then there is no peace, but only a delusional, illusory, dangerous state of constant threat of war. However, the pathologically stupid, senseless and reasonless upper elites, the consciousness disturbed, ruling and irresponsible, armament addicts, senseless and reasonless of the weapon-balancing states are unable to understand this, because their abysmally low intelligence functions below the educational level and level of a pathologically abnormal and hopelessly insane and crazy person. Rearmament and the creation of a balance of arms can never be a guarantor of peace, because it can never create or maintain peace and freedom, but only evoke, effectively create and spread more and more hostilities, wars, hatred, death, murder, misery, distress, fear and anxiety, destruction and annihilation. And this is a fact that has been proven since time immemorial, since earthly humanity has existed, since it has spread on Earth at all. And if we take a close look at humanity on Earth during the last 10,000 years, we find that less than 250 years have passed without any acts of war taking place worldwide, but nevertheless with constant fear and terror due to enmities, hatred, and threats. And as I have already mentioned several times in conversations, that part of the U.S. American people who strive for peace, justice, and freedom, and who are not informed by the power-obsessed political government elite, the secret services, and by the military powers of various kinds about the reality of their secret, underhanded, unpeaceful, and warmongering machinations, etc., but are constantly deceived and cheated by misinformation. The majority of the upper elites of the United States of America are enemies of peace, freedom, and justice, and exactly these three high values should be the pillars of every country or state. But they are not present in the effective upper leadership elites, and those responsible for the welfare of the entire people of the USA. America was in former times, when it was settled, conquered and built up by the immigrants, a project of peace, freedom, hope, and prosperity. But this founding idea could not gain a foothold already in the early beginning and should have been restored already at the time of the founding. But this was not done. Nor is it being done today, even though it should have always meant for the USA that only the high values of peace, justice, and freedom are valid, and that injustice, warmongering, and the lust for world domination should never again be allowed to occur. Peace, justice, and freedom should be the pillars of the USA, and should be spread worldwide by the USA. But exactly the opposite is the case, which is why, as has been the case since time immemorial, we have to ask what the future holds for U.S. America and its worldwide underhanded and warmongering, as well as world domination-addicted heirs and machinations. U.S. America needs an emotional and identity-forming model that would give the upper leadership elites and irresponsible state leaders a hard march and lead them to peace, true freedom and justice, and to discard their high-handed power behavior and exchange it for a leadership that is fit for life and humanity. As it has been since time immemorial, and also today with regard to the image of the USA and those citizens who support and endorse all that is criminal, devious, warmongering, unpeaceful, unfreedom, and unjust on the part of the ruling elites and those in charge. It must be said that in these relations, this citizenship and the related state system have been completely watered down. And this causes rejection not only among that part of the population of America which abhors all criminal, world domination addicted, warmongering and criminal machinations of the upper leadership elites and irresponsible state-leading responsible persons as well as their fellow travelers of all kinds, but also among all human beings worldwide. Since their existence, the powerful elites of the USA have not had any rational and sensible achievements aimed at never again starting a war in the world, just as they also have only contempt for all those national citizens and all human beings in general who are not of their own mind. Only for their followers, fellow travelers, and like-minded people in the nation and in the world are they willing to allow a certain prosperity, while all others count for nothing. Consequently, these disregarded human beings have no vision for the future and are steadily impoverished and regarded as a necessary evil. Political ideologies are the true concepts of the desirable for the ruling elites and their brainless followers, while all those human beings who righteously perform their civic duty are considered last class and treated badly. The USA, just like the EU dictatorship, lacks all human connecting, peaceful, liberal, and justice-oriented visions, as a result of which only monstrous problems, crises, terrorism, warmongering, and a desire for world domination are in the foreground. The USA is not simply a victim of the times, but of possessiveness and megalomania, which already played the most important role when the country was settled and then also when it became a state, and which led to the indigenous people being fought, and many indigenous tribes being almost or completely wiped out, as also happened with the huge herds of buffalo. From the very beginning of the USA, the immigrants from Europe, mainly criminals and sectarians from Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Scotland, Italy, and England, etc., have committed mistake after mistake. Criminal acts, crimes, and all kinds of evils of all kinds, as well as waging civil war and wars all over the world and exercising the lust for power and world domination in a violent manner. America has never achieved the original goals of peace, freedom, and justice, but has instead become entangled in war, crime, and criminality, be it through the theft of land and the bloody near extinction of the indigenous peoples, the Indian tribes, or through the mafia, the delusion of world domination and if it is considered that a not insignificant part of the early emigrants and American settlers from Europe were good-believing good and Christian people, who then caused much suffering, misery, and disaster in the promised land with robbery, murder, and manslaughter, then it is not surprising what has become of this country and its upper irresponsible leadership elites as well as their fellow travelers among the people. This, while on the other hand the righteous of the population, who are unfortunately in the minority and have no chance against the unrighteous and the irresponsible state powers and the like-minded followers who howl along with their criminal machinations thoughtlessly, are being harassed. And indeed, the righteous part of the U.S. population has no say and no influence on the ruling elites and their rotten machinations against peace, freedom, and justice, which is why strife, lack of freedom, injustice, and murderous and criminal legislation with the death penalty continue to prevail in their own country through the USA. This is in addition to the fact that unspeakable suffering, misery, death, and destruction are repeatedly spread in large parts of the world by the U.S. American addiction to world domination and murderous and terrorist Secret Service actions. The immigrants of the USA did not bring peace, freedom, and justice into the country. Consequently, they also never worked towards creating these values from the very beginning, because the meaning of peace, freedom, and justice was also never understood. On the contrary, all kinds of evil, crime, murder, and manslaughter and other crimes were the order of the day from the very beginning, as well as murderous and massacre-like action against the Indians, from whom the land of their homeland was stolen and robbed by the immigrants and the army through bloody massacres and battles. This also resulted from the farmers and ranchers when Far West or Wild West was conquered. Many of the religious and sectarian immigrants did not know the benefits of peace, liberty, and justice, nor therefore the value of honesty, righteousness, and the protection and respect of life. On the contrary, only infidelity, unrighteousness, criminality, and crime were inherent in countless immigrants, as well as the addiction to might and wealth, which has continued to a great extent up to the present time of the third millennium and in the entire U.S. America. This has been preserved and spread to a great extent until the present time of the third millennium and in the whole of U.S. America. However, the whole of this has also spread to the lowest tip of South America and back to Europe and even the whole world, with much of the U.S. crime and criminal systems rubbing off on many like-minded groups and organizations in other countries. All this cannot whip the age-old malignant and bad image of the United States of America into shape, neither among the part of the righteous U.S. citizenry nor throughout the world. Because if everything were to improve, then the majority of U.S. laws and behavior, etc., would have to be thoroughly changed for the better, the good, the humane, and the progressive. However, it is extremely doubtful and unlikely that this will happen, because where the greed for power and world domination, the insidiousness, the addiction to war, unfreedom, discord, terror, and injustice have once gained a foothold, these horrors are also maintained and carried out by brute force, by hook or by crook, and countless deaths are accepted without hesitation in bloody battles. Effectively, it would now be up to the U.S. American population to stand up to the criminal behavior of the fallible leadership elite and its stupid followers from the people, to enable that part of the U.S. American population to lead the country, which is righteous and strives for effective peace, for real freedom, and for fundamental justice. The task of the entire U.S. population would have to be to return to the founding values of humanity and clean and correct governance, to rid itself of the world domination and war airs and the unjust and inhumane legislations, torture and capital punishment, unfreedom, strife, and all state injustice. A vision of the future for real-world peace, effective freedom, and absolute justice would have to develop in the entire U.S. population. The USA and its entire population would have to stand for this in the world, in order to live the true values of life and also to carry them out into the vastness of the earth and to all peoples. The fact is that the existing image of the USA and the unrighteous part of the U.S. population is crying wolf all over the world, so that an image campaign would also be of no use. Effectively, a totalitarian change for the better and the good would have to take place. But this would require real, sophisticated, and well-considered positive programs behind which the human beings could stand with conscious and clear certainty and a sure trust. This alone could be the hope that the United States of America and its entire population could manage to find a way forward, building on the great values of peace, freedom, and justice. The question is, however, whether such values are at all desirable and worth striving for the unrighteous of U.S. America, the irresponsible of the leadership elite and their fellow travelers and followers from the people, or whether they want to continue to muddle along in their criminal behavior of power, because it is questionable whether they want to show solidarity with the righteous part of the U.S. citizenry and also want to unite with all countries of the earth in peace, freedom, and justice. There are certain basics of correct human behavior in the Christian world, and a Christian tradition of charity, as also in all other religions and sects, although the Christian world emphasizes these particularly loudmouthed. But this tradition of charity is only written on Bible paper, but is not cultivated and in reality only corresponds to an empty, hollow phrase, which is threshed like empty straw. But in reality, everything is nothing more than smoke and mirrors, because when it comes to living these principles and traditions, everything is nipped in the bud by addiction, greed for power, selfishness, egoism, and all that is evil, bad, and by the greed of self-importance and wanting to rule. If we think of the slogans of the French Revolution, when the call liberté, égalité, fraternity or liberty, equality and fraternity was coined, which can now also be extended to peace. Liberty and justices, then in today's world, especially in the USA, this leads to the need to create a very large new value process and define what the United States of America actually is. This country in particular should basically have a worldwide mission for the creation and expansion of peace, freedom, and justice, because the only thing behind this is the true idea that all earthly human beings can identify with the fulfillment of the creational natural laws that enable every single human being to live a life in peace, freedom, and justice in accordance with creation. The USA and the whole of humanity must stand behind this idea alone, comprehend it and cultivate it, because it corresponds to the natural creational laws. And this idea is given since the existence of the creation of universal consciousness, that is to say of the universe and everything existing in it, and therefore does not have to be invented from scratch. Originally, the country of America was a project of peace, prosperity, and salvation for many emigrants from Europe and other countries, but also for criminals, and all kinds of sectarian groups who, as a result of their sectarianism, had to leave their homeland and settle in the new country of America. But the early founding idea of peace, freedom, and justice, which was never fulfilled, should now finally be restored and translated into reality, because today, for the USA and the unjust part of the population, it should no longer mean that strife, unfreedom, and injustice have the upper hand, but, on the contrary, effective peace, true freedom, and justice reigning alone. Only these values, which must also be connected with the corresponding correct, good, right, and valuable behavior in every respect, offer a true way of life and quality of life for all human beings, adapted to the creational natural laws. It must also not be the case that, as is extremely expressed in the USA, everything is only about wealth and that the quality of life is given priority in this way. The quality of life encompasses many more levels, not only prosperity, ecology, wealth, economy, and pleasure, but also peace, freedom, and justice, as well as honest joy, love and humanity, etc. Only when all this is true and cultivated, like many other good and positive aspects, can one speak of a creational, natural, authentic way of life and quality of life. And for this to apply to the USA and its population, in the USA, and in every U.S. state, the human beings would have to be individually responsible, capable of dialogue and creative, just as personal inner peace, inner freedom, and a sense of justice would have to be a reality and implemented and lived out in every conceivable relationship. And these high values must be decided and realized by the human beings in the USA, as also in the whole world, on as many levels of behavior as possible.
What and how you say everything is also in my mind. Unfortunately, however, it has been the case since time immemorial that the majority of earthly humanity does not respond to understanding and reason, because in its poverty of understanding and reason, it is not able to perceive reality and the truth contained in it alone. And this is a very distressing factor that arises in all relationships, which is why all presentations and explanations regarding reality and the truth arising from it that are true to intellect and reason are not recognized and consequently also not accepted, but are falsely insulted as lies or conspiracy theories. Therefore, even your openly given explanations will not be taken as explanations of the real conditions and truth with regard to the effective backgrounds and the devious machinations and world domination behavior of the United States of America by the unsophisticated majority of earthly mankind, but rather that everything you have said and explained is supposed to be a lie or conspiracy theory. And that, unfortunately, will always be the case, as my father also explained it to you during a special conversation, as I recently read in his notes, which I can translate for you and bring to you if you are interested.
Actually, I thought that all that you have translated from the annals of your father Shvath and brought to me should be enough, but perhaps there could be some more of importance to mention.
Then I will endeavor to do so.
But there is no hurry, and besides, it does not change the fact that there are always some people who insult everything that is reality and truth as lies, or spread them as conspiracy theories. This is also the case with regard to our connection or our contacts and the resulting reports of conversations. And the fact that since I made our contacts public, which was in your sense and not in mine, have been coveted, fought against, belittled, denigrated and disqualified as liar, cheat and swindler, etc. by malicious antagonists, envious people, intriguers and slanderers, even from my own family, is something I have got used to and do not bother about. I can only feel sorry for people who use such methods, regardless of whether they act in this way maliciously, out of revenge or self-aggrandizement, etc., and use dirty lies, behavior and slander to satisfy themselves, elevating themselves, as do those who want to tear me apart because they cannot cope with reality and its truth. However, I have to say that there are always people with good sense who do not give a damn about lies and slander, who do not get involved and do not fall for untruthful claims, but who, as I said, use their sense and reason to get to the bottom of the facts through their own honest and righteous efforts, and to find the effective truth. However, only honest, righteous people with absolute integrity are capable of this, who do not exalt themselves megalomaniacally, but who are also honestly interested in what the real reality and its truth is. This has now been done again by a person called Joe Tusk, who comes from the USA and lives in Thailand, because he has got to the bottom of the matter that happened in connection with the article in The Statesman in New Delhi in India. He summarized his report and what he said in a longer article, which he sent to Christian Frainer and which Florina also photographed and beamed to you, but which I also want to include here in our conversation.
Billy Meier UFO photos, films and contacts with extraterrestrials. What the skeptics and others need to know. The 20th of January, 2018. Joe Tysk, Thailand.
Undeniably, the Billy Meier story is one of the most controversial UFO or alien cases of all time. It spans more than 70 years and is still ongoing, as Billy Meier is currently still alive and will soon turn 81 on the 3rd of February, 2018. While many think that the Billy Meier case started in the mid-1970s, 1975 to be exact, note Figu, the story of Billy and the Clearan basically started back in 1937. We have to focus on 1964. The reason is that it was in 1964 in India that Billy Meier was interviewed by a reporter for the New Delhi Statesman. And why is this important? It is important because the interview, and what was reported in it, lays the foundation for building the case, and for the Billy Meier contact story being real. It is therefore necessary that we examine in detail the 1964 newspaper article, and other corroborating material from that period before jumping to 1975, the point at which most skeptics launch their attacks, and call him a fraud. Let us therefore go to that article. Billy Meier, 27 years old and then known by his birth name Eduard Albert Meier, had been in India for about 5 months when he was approached by a reporter from the New Delhi Statesman, who had heard about this strange flying saucer man. Although Meier agreed to be interviewed, he made it clear to the reporter that he was not looking for publicity and that he was not interested in whether anyone believed his story. And what kind of story it was, Billy claimed that he had not only seen objects from space, but that he had taken photos of them and even traveled with them. Such claims would probably not be taken at face value by most and rejected, but Meier showed the reporter a photo album he had with him which, according to the reporter, contained about 80 photos of UFOs. Now everyone's first question should be, where did Billy Meier get a photo album with dozens of UFO photos in 1964? Obviously, there were no UFO photos art shops in India at that time, so how and where could he have amassed all these photos if he did not take them himself, as was said of him? Some skeptics answer this question with insinuations like he had a photo enlarger, or he had access to a photo lab or darkroom. Which is ridiculous because these far-fetched explanations still do not address the basic question. Where did Billy Meier get a photo album with dozens of UFO photos back in 1964? Now, even if one were to agree with the logical explanation of where Billy Meier got the photos, namely that he took them himself, the next question comes, were these photos faked? To help answer this question, we turn to 2 people who were at the place where Billy Meier claimed to have taken the UFO photos, the Ashoka Ashram, a Buddhist temple where Billy had spent some time when he was in India. What is interesting about these 2 people is that they claim to have seen the same UFOs that Billy had photographed and that were in his photo album. Not only that, but these 2 people told the story at the UFO Congress held in Laughlin, Nevada, USA, on the 23rd of February, 1999, 35 years after the sighting and taking of the photographs as claimed. The first person to tell her story at the Congress was Phobal Cheng. She is the granddaughter of the Buddhist monk who founded Ashoka Ashram, was 9 years old at the time, remembered Billy, and reported seeing the UFOs herself. After telling this to Congress participants, Phobal's longtime friend Sasha Raj, who had traveled from India, confirmed that she had also seen UFOs in the sky above Ashoka Ashram, as had others who had worked at the property. To put it in perspective, we have 2 people here who have nothing to gain by being willing to come forward with their story after years, though it was not easy. And beyond that, the connection with Billy Meier and the impression he had made on Phobal Cheng was something special. Which is why she actually traveled from the United States, where she lived, to Switzerland to visit him not once, but twice. On her second trip, she brought her husband and they ended up spending 2 weeks at Meier's home. Let us now look at what we have together and where we stand. One simple way is to use the 3 aspects used in the criminal code to determine whether someone is guilty of a crime or, in this case, fraud. These 3 aspects are means, motive and opportunity, and we will apply each aspect to determine what logical conclusion can be drawn regarding the pros and cons of a fraud perpetrated by Billy Meier going back to 1964. If no fraud can be found in 1964, then this is a strong indication that there is no reason for him to commit fraud in 1975 or any time later. We start with the means. In 1964, Billy Meier was basically backpacking, from country to country, with a meager income from odd jobs. At the time of the interview, the reporter noticed that the only items Billy owned were a few pieces of clothing, a bellows camera, 2 small bags, and his photo album. Not a very good time to get into the UFO forgery business, when bare survival was already a challenge. Forging dozens of different UFO photos, some of which he even still has today, clearly showing images of some types of spacecraft, would have been more than just extremely difficult at the time, in fact almost an impossibility. The second and perhaps most important aspect we have to deal with is motive. As the newspaper reporter states in his article, and I quote, "He is clearly not eager to talk about his experiences, which are remarkable, to say the least." Indeed, what little he has to say has to be squeezed out of him. He does not want publicity. He does not care if anyone believes him or not. It is important to note that Billy Meier, with his serious need for funds, never offered to sell any of his photographs to the reporter or anyone else. If this had all been a scam, one would expect to have heard stories about how Meier went around telling others his strange stories in order to profit. I am sure that if he was capable of willfully faking UFO photos, he would have been capable of making money from them, but there is no evidence that this was ever the case. Therefore, there is no known motive, and we can cross this aspect off the list. The third element is opportunity. Meier is in an area and country with which he is not familiar. He has no known friends or contacts, and one of the few items he has is his old camera. And yet somehow he is supposed to be able to fake dozens of UFO photos without being discovered and without any known accomplices. Since we already have other witnesses who have come forward and reported seeing the same objects in the sky that ended up in Meier's album, I think we can also dismiss the opportunity aspect. Where does all this lead us? If we have proof that Billy Meier has been amassing a collection of UFO photos since 1964, and then 11 years later he started taking clearer and more detailed UFO photos in Switzerland where he lives, does that give us a reason to still be skeptical? One could say yes, if it were not for the fact that in addition to the photos, Meier was able to make films of the alien craft with which he claims to be in contact. Faking UFO photos is one thing, faking UFO films is quite another. Wally Gentleman's explanation. At the time Wally Gentleman was able to view the photos and films Billy Meier had taken, he had already been involved in special effects for 35 years. He was such an accomplished expert in the art of special effects that Stanley Kubrick specifically chose and hired Wally Gentleman as director of special photographic effects for the science fiction film 2001. A Space Odyssey. He worked in this position for a year and a half until the film was finished. As the person in charge of all special effects, Gentleman was also responsible for the construction of the space flight model used in the film. So needless to say, if anyone could debunk UFO photos and films at the time, it was Wally Gentleman. Here follows what Wally Gentleman found and reported after viewing the Billy Meier footage. Quoted from the book Light Years, an investigation into the extraterrestrial experiences of Eduard Meier by Gary Kinder. After studying the films, gentlemen concluded that a one-armed man could not possibly have made the film without assistance, given the expertise, logistics, and cost required. Note: Billy Meier lost his left arm in a bus accident in Turkey in 1965. "That's the fundamental of it all," he said. "This guy Meier would really have to have a fleet of clever helpers, at least 15 people, who know what the reflections of the seams of a shiny object are at a certain time of day. How to hang these objects so the wires cannot be seen, how to set it up, how to watch it and stand by with the little sprays of paint to spray the wires when they start to show. What we would do is go out and shoot the scene and then bring it back to the studio, and then put the object on the film using duplication processes, which is a highly complex procedure. It's difficult with 35mm film, and even more difficult with Super 8mm film, which he used, and the equipment is totally out of his means. If someone wants me to fake something on the same scale, maybe $30,000 would do it, but this would be in a studio where the equipment is available. The equipment would cost another $50,000. Note: at the time the films were being made, Billy was scraping together everything he had, because to make a living, anything was a challenge. I think that the statement of all this is that a single man with one arm, if he was actually alone, could not have done this. I think it would be quite a miracle for a person with two arms to do something like that on top of a mountain by himself. Even if you take a balloon and hang the object from a fine wire underneath, it will be blown in one direction wherever. And in some pictures where there are 3 or more flying saucers, you would need balloons with strings of different lengths, otherwise you could make out where the strings were coming from. It would be very difficult to shoot such scenes outdoors in this environment. And the slope poses a big risk to do something like that. It's complications like that make me think that the objects he photographed and filmed were actually there and he just had to press the shutter. To sum up, what one of the world's leading special effects experts, Wally Gentleman, said is that Billy Meier could not have faked the videos in any way. Anyone who doubts this statement, read again what he said. Billy Meier simply did not have the resources it would have taken to produce the UFO videos that Wally Gentleman reviewed and gave professional expert opinion on. In addition to Wally Gentleman, there were a number of other experts in various fields over the years who, after conducting their research, could only say that if Meier was perpetrating a fraud, they had no idea how he was doing it. Others, not wanting to say they were baffled, offered as an attempted explanation for the fraud that perhaps he had used scale models suspended from a helicopter. Seriously? Of course, none of this is good enough for the stubborn skeptics. What the skeptics do is prefer to focus only on what they think proves that the Billy Meier UFO story is a fraud, rather than looking at the best certain evidence that supports the authenticity of the photos and films. However, any good investigator knows that when you look at evidence, you look at all of it, not just what you think makes the case the way you want it to be. And contrary to what many think, it is not the amount of seemingly incriminating evidence that wins, but whether you have a single piece of evidence that supports your position. In the following example, let's assume that someone was shot and killed outside a nightclub. Next to the body, a driver's license is found with a photo of Max Musterman, who is known to have had an argument with the victim. Furthermore, there are 2 eyewitnesses who saw the shooting and after looking at police mug shots, are certain that Max Musterman, identified on the driving license photo, was the shooter. In addition, police are able to determine that the suspect owns a handgun that is the same caliber as the one used in the shooting. Based on what appears to be solid evidence against Max Musterman, many including law enforcement officials would say it is a clear case to arrest him and possibly convict him of the crime in a court of law. But there is one small problem. Max Musterman has one piece of evidence that triumphs over everything else. He claims, and will later prove, that he was over 1,000 miles away attending a wedding at the time of the murder. So what looked like conclusive evidence turned out to be false, and it only took one piece of irrefutable evidence to exonerate Max Musterman and declare him innocent. Instead of looking only at those parts of the story that are controversial and can be debated, it is important to be unbiased and not draw any conclusions until all the evidence has been reviewed, especially when there is more than enough evidence to support the Billy Meier UFO contact claim, if one would only look. Even if it were proven that the vast photo collection contained some photos of models or images of other objects that did not support Meier's story, that would in no way invalidate the authenticity of the photos and film that experts like Wally Gentleman say are real. By using logical combinatorial reasoning, an argument can remain valid even if one or more assumptions are false. In other words, if it is claimed that all of Billy Meier's photos are real, and it is later determined that this is not true, we do not discard the evidence that supports the case, which is often done by the skeptics. Again, all evidence needs verification, but not all evidence has to support the case to make it authentic, and that is a fact. Assuming people now get on board with the statement that Billy Meier took real photos of UFOs and even made films of this craft, we must now ask the big question: in addition to taking real photos and films of UFOs, actual extraterrestrial craft, did Billy Meier ever have contact with extraterrestrials? Remember that he claimed this a long time ago, in 1964, in the interview he gave to the reporter in India. To be able to clarify this, we conclude that the only way Billy Meier could have taken these photos and made the films was if he had advanced knowledge of when and where the UFOs were going to appear. It would have been literally impossible for him to just happen to be in the right place at the right time to take all the photos and film, which he has done over the years. Somehow Billy Meier had to have been contacted in advance and informed when to be where. And the only people who could have provided him with this information were those on board the UFOs, or those who controlled them. Rather than go into further detail, I leave it to the readers to see if there are enough points to tie in here, and I think there are. In conclusion, I would say that based on the available evidence and expert opinion, the only logical conclusion one can come to is that Billy Meier took numerous genuine photographs of UFOs, and, more importantly, even films of UFOs, and that he did so over a span of many years. There is also much more corroborating evidence to support the Billy Meier case, but this is not reported in this article, as this can be easily found from various sources on the internet. Of course, this will never be enough for a persistent skeptic, because when human beings take a side or a stand, which they often do with politics and religion, virtually nothing will change their stance. No matter how strong the evidence may be, such as that presented here. I conclude and say that I did not write this article with the intention of changing even one skeptic, because I know I will not be able to. This article was simply written for those who have an open mind, a reasonable intelligence, and a desire for truth. Joe Tysk served in the USAF, U.S. Air Force, Office of Special Investigations OSI, during the late 1960s and early 1970s. During his assignment with OSI, he supervised hundreds of high-level personnel investigations for the USAF and other agencies in the Department of Defense. Although his time and experience with OSI was helpful in researching and evaluating the Billy Meier case, he does not believe that any special training or knowledge is required for proper research and evaluation of the Billy Meier UFO story. He believes that simply following the evidence and using logic and reason will lead one to the correct decision. Anyone wishing to contact Joe can reach him as follows: joedusk48@gmail.com. Addendum regarding Wally Gentleman. On the internet at http://imdb.com.ref_equals fn_all_nm_1 the following can be found. Wally Gentleman, 1926 to 2001, born in the UK, was a Canadian cinematographer and founder of the Montreal-based SPEAC, or Special Photographic Effects, and Allied Crafts. In 1998 he built the model spaceships for Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey. Born 1926 in Useley, London Borough of Hillingdon, England, UK, died 2001 aged 75. On Phobal Cheng and Sasha Raj, the following is an excerpt from FIGU Special Bulletin number 64 http://www. FIGU, Augur CH, files or downloads a bulletin of FIGU_sonda_bulletin_64. PDF. Phobal Cheng, former United Nations diplomat for Cambodia, lived as a child in Ashoka Ashram, Marauli, New Delhi, India. Her grandfather was the head Buddhist monk of the ashram. She saw Askat with her own eyes, that is to say, she saw Maya and Askat together several times, and saw Askat's ray ship hovering over the ashram more than once. Once she entered her grandfather's ashram and saw two strange men dressed in white robes sitting on either side of her grandfather and talking to him. She caught part of the conversation, and when the conversation was over, the men suddenly disappeared, apparently in the same way that Maya often did herself at the beginning of a contact. So Phobal then knew that these men were not from Earth. A few years ago, 1999, the highly respected civil servant gave up her anonymity and spoke out in front of crowds to tell her story. And what, pray tell, would she gain by doing so, except possibly the same ridicule as Maya? Ms. Sashi, an Indian, taught Phobal Hindi. Since Phobal and her brother were from Cambodia, they had to learn that language. She did not look much older than Phobal, and was perhaps not more than 20 years old when Phobal was 10, and had seen Maya together with Askat in 1963. Maya still had his left arm then. Mrs. For this reason, Mrs. More on this subject on the DVD, Reopening of the Maya Case, International UFO Congress, 1999. Translations, Christian Frenner, Switzerland.
And finally, additional information written down by Billy Edward Albert Meyer on 23.1. 2018 information on the events in connection with the photo album mentioned above.
It would be important to mention that I had spoken to a consular representative in Jordan's capital Amman, who was interested in my life and everything around, also wanting to see what I was carrying in my small backpack. In it were also my still incomplete photo album with the jet ship pictures, because I still had many photos in an envelope that I had deposited with a few other of my belongings with my acquaintance Adnan Shukri in Amman, where I worked for a short time in his marble slab shop in order to make ends meet again financially. While looking through them, the consular representative showed particular interest and asked how, where and when I had taken these pictures. With an evasive answer, I explained to him that just by chance an opportunity arose here and there to take the photos, and that I did not say anything about my contacts with Askit. This was especially because he asked strange questions, and I also wanted to know to which state such flying machines, which looked so futuristic, and was certainly a dangerous secret weapon, which belonged, to which I told him that I did not know, and would assume that it was not an earthly technology, but rather something extraterrestrial, perhaps from Mars or something, because there were certainly many possibilities of origin, if these flying plates really came from outside Earth, and so on. 2 days later, I was arrested by the military police and interrogated by them and the secret police. They took away my half-finished photo album, confiscated it and accused me of being a spy from Mars and of scouting out the Arab world, which was probably about to be invaded by Martians. I was accused of having done the same in Algeria because there was proof of this, and they presented me with documents from some Algerian office with my likeness, whereby I could only confirm that the 2 photos depicting me could only really have come from Algeria, when I had previously worked there. The whole interrogation procedure, which I found completely idiotic, lasted a good 6 hours. Then I demanded a telephone conversation with the Swiss consul in Jerusalem, which had the effect that the interrogation ended very quickly, and I was put out on the street, so to speak, and left alone from then on. However, the half-finished photo album remained confiscated, which is why I later made another small album with the jet ship photos, which I also took with me to India, where, at the insistence of the Statesman journalist, I presented it to him for inspection. How and why this journalist at Ashoka Ashram became aware of me and interviewed me emerged from the conversation. He explained that he and the editors of The Statesman had been informed by people around Marauli, whom I had treated as Dr. Saab at the ashram, as well as by people at the ashram, that since I had been there, alien flying saucers had been flying over the Ashoka Ashram and over Marauli. Moreover, it had been reported that I had also often, when such flying saucers were observed, walked around the ashram premises with a young pretty woman wearing a futuristic and shimmering silver comber dress, during which we had talked a lot.
What you have said is good, as is what this man has written regarding his research with his remarks. But I also want to explain something about what you have said with regard to scheming human beings of all kinds who insult you, slander you, and accuse you of lies, deceit, and charlatanism against all truth. What you have explained is good and correct, but there is more to the description of a scheming man that needs explanation. Such human beings are unfortunate creatures who lie to themselves, cheat and slander themselves, who have to be present everywhere, who give their stupid and ridiculous opinions on everything and everyone without being asked, who disagree with themselves and who are also addicted to megalomania and arrogance. Human beings who behave in this way in order to denigrate and make others impossible in front of their fellow human beings, as well as to destroy their good work, righteous deeds and behavior, etc., correspond in their character and behavior to a pathological wretchedness. Such creatures always want to be in the right in their injustice and are of the mistaken opinion that they are infinitely knowledgeable in their ignorance. Such human beings are the epitome of a megalomaniac complacency and lead a blasphemous double standard which they claim to be absolute. Intriguing human beings are without exception unrighteous, do not know themselves, and, despite a certain illusory education, are stupid, ignorant, and small-minded, as a result of which they are unable to get to know themselves and judge their irrational and irrational thinking. In their illogical and retarded ways of thinking and behaving, they are also unable to realize that they are insane and deviant in this respect, and that they make themselves impossible in their environment and cause harm to themselves. And this fact leads to the fact that such creatures are only tolerated in their fellow human environment, but are not recognized as righteous, have no true but only pretended and dishonest friendships, in which the pretense of false respect and taking advantage in some way play a major role. The pretended friendships seek a closeness to intriguers in order not to make enemies of them. Consequently, they create a false friendship and are always ready to offer their services to the intriguers in an exaggeratedly busy and hasty manner, so as to ingratiate themselves and remain untroubled by intrigues. Intriguers are selfish, infamous, lying, deceitful human beings addicted to falsehood, who crave a great deal of attention and praise, and whose pathologically disturbed ego is so great that it extends to narcissism. Intriguers live under the delusion of possessing all knowledge and knowing everything in every respect, even without having been present at anything or having experienced anything themselves. In this way, however, they cling to some fixed ideas in a pathological delusion, because they have become deluded into believing them and can neither recognize nor understand the effective facts and the truth, even when irrefutable evidence can be presented to them. Their irrevocable desire is so absolutely directed towards wanting to impose their opinion on their fellow men, as well as to discipline others at all costs, and to prescribe to them what they should accept and do according to faith, whereby it is, as a rule, all things, thoughts, actions, assumptions, and behavior, etc., in which they recognize themselves. Basically, these things are, in the case of the schemers, their own pathological building sites or things which they themselves cannot master, cannot work out for themselves in righteous ways, cannot keep under control, and cannot master. Through their intrigues, slander, and all evil, intriguers force themselves to their deviant actions, doings, and behavior, and thus live under the delusion that they would thereby be accepted by their fellow human beings, whereas they themselves do not accept other people, just as they do not accept what others do, achieve, produce, and create. Intriguers are only able to recognize something or a person if they can create an ideological connection in some form and get lost in it. Intriguers insist on things, however illogical they may be, and do so vehemently, and do not stop doing so even when they can be logically proved wrong. So schemers have a big and very diverse pathological problem that does not even stop at just creating fake friendships and harming themselves with their own know-it-all attitude and scheming.
Thank you. That is much more detailed than what I said. This clarifies a few things, but as you have already mentioned, these kinds of people will not be taught and will continue to display their stupidity, as they have done up to now. Such creatures, as you call them, unfortunately lack not only intellect, reason, and intelligence, but also a healthy self-worth and decency, respect and regard for themselves. And as it has been said since time immemorial, stupidity knows no bounds. And this is unfortunately widespread throughout the world, which also proves to be the case with the believers, the religions and sects, who believe, as I experience again and again, that the so-called New Testament of Christianity can be traced directly back to Emmanuel, and the Quran directly back to Muhammad, precisely that Emmanuel and Muhammad themselves would have talked and taught all the cheese that is written in the books. It does not want to be understood or accepted that neither of them had dictated or written even one letter themselves, but that all the books, false teachings, laws, commandments, and all the evils and wickednesses, wars, death sentences, murders and destructions, etc., that came out of them were invented and fabricated afterwards by followers, believers and delusionists, etc. Emmanuel, as well as Muhammad, did not preach punishment or war, let alone wage it, as is claimed, for example, with regard to Muhammad, whose entire life story was falsified many times more than that of Emmanuel. With Muhammad there was no Sharia, no compulsory headscarf, no child marriage, no covering of the face, and many other things, as was invented long after his death, and books of lies were written from it. The teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad was the one and only teaching of the prophets, the Spirit teaching, which was given as teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and which also exists today in a whole series of books, whereby the two works and Cup of Truth were both taught by Emmanuel and Muhammad, but were neither understood nor lived by the people of those times. On the contrary, the entire teachings were profoundly falsified and so straightened out that murderous delusions arose, which could not be reconciled with the teachings or only in small parts, and caused enormous suffering, hardship, misery, wars, persecutions, deaths, murders, and destruction. One only has to think of the early and later persecutions and murders of Christians, as well as war campaigns, etc., as well as the Inquisition and other murderous events in the name of Christianity, and equally of the tremendous atrocities that were carried out unlawfully, mendaciously, and criminally in the name of Muhammad and his teachings. And this happened and still happens today, although neither Emmanuel nor Muhammad ever taught in this way, but, like all prophets before them, consistently adhered honorably and worthily to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and did not misteach anything about domination, lust for power, inhuman punishment or capital punishment, child marriage, mummery, war, conquest, torture, human trafficking and the like, or other nonsense, imbecility and other time-honored inhumanities.
Which I guess I do not have to say anything about. But what I do have to mention is Marianne's article, which I of course read and found to be good, and which you can insert here when you retrieve it during our conversation.
An algorithm in the body, curse or blessing.
For some time now, the NCC has been publishing more and more extremely informative, instructive, well-written and also amusing guest commentaries on the broad topic of artificial intelligence, or AI for short, usually adorned with an appropriate cartoon. Basically, AI, artificial intelligence, is about creating something that is infallible, so to speak, in contrast to inadequate human beings with their various weaknesses. Let's just think of the lack of concentration and endurance, the slowness in thinking, the imprecision in the execution of work, the forgetfulness, the listlessness, the insufficiency, the need for sleep, the required food, the self-will, etc., etc. The fact that for the time being, and also far into the future, it is still the inadequate human being who creates the programs, is ignored by the AI enthusiasts, that is to say the nerds or digitalists Klingler. Their longing is the fusion of human beings and machines. The RFID chipped among them have already made a start. The term algorithm belongs to AI. But what is an algorithm anyway? On the internet under the link https://datenschutzboftragtragterinfo.de/ you can find, among other things, a casual one-sentence explanation. An algorithm is a set of instructions, a recipe, etc., for solving a particular problem. First and foremost, it is about the efficiency of a constantly repeating process. This used to be called program modules, which it actually is, but nowadays everything is more mathematically sophisticated than in the days of sequential batch or batch processing for commercial purposes. The more elegant the programming language, the more complex the compiler, translator. Anyone who wants to create algorithms must therefore understand a great deal about mathematics, computer science, and, of course, neurology, because it is primarily a matter of mathematical formulas that are ultimately introduced into the brain or otherwise into the body and are supposed to do their work there. Examples of algorithms are GPS calculations, computer opponents in chess e.g. Deep Blue by IBM, Google Search, Google Maps, data mining, intelligent, smart applications, traffic lights, predictive forensics, weapons control drones, missiles, etc. 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 There are many forms and types of algorithms, all of which also have a name. If you want to know more about them, take a look at the Google & Co. treasure trove, whose search mechanism is also controlled by a secret algorithm. Each author of the guest articles mentioned illuminates a different side of artificial intelligence. Wolfram Klingler, for example, sees a parallel between the digitalists and the fanatics of other religions. And Peter Glaser, a publicist in Berlin, is concerned with the transformation of utopia into weapons technology, the machine as the measure of all things. That this is by no means a utopia or a fantasy is proven by the prediction of Billy Edward Albert Meyer. Billy Edward Albert Meyer, Contact 251 from 3rd of February, 1995, sentences 269 to 271 ff. Book, Profession und Voraussichten, Wassermann-Zeit Verlag. Figu, the new threatening war will break out and last about 40 years, whereby, however, first of all, about 6 years before, human beings will be reconstructed into machines or robots. This will lead to great problems about 85 years later, when, as in the earliest times before, the scientists who have become powerful begin to play God and create new genetic breeds between human beings and animals, who then declare their solidarity with the robot people as half-humans. Until then, however, more than 8 decades will pass after the robot-human creation, as has already been said. With the creation of the robot humans, intelligent robots of a biological electronic machine kind will also be constructed, as well as a very large space station which will have its own orbit around the sun and on which very many human beings will live. Edward Kaiser, a physicist with a doctorate in philosophy, teacher, freelance publicist, and jazz musician, explains the algorithmic problem-solving process in a humorous way in his article entitled Der Hang zu Neoprimitivem Technoanimismus, Beherrschung uns Algorithmen wirklich. The tendency to neo-primitive techno-animism. Do algorithms really control us? Using 100 disordered socks in a tumble dryer as an example. But he also warns of the dangers of believing in algorithms, around which a hype is made that is not understood by most human beings. The article, which can be found on the NZZ website, is definitely worth reading. Just like all the others. A small section of it clearly shows what must be understood by artificial intelligence for the time being, in order to avoid tipping over into a devotional attitude towards them. The algorithms, like all metaphors, the metaphor of the algorithm is also a caricature. Algorithms are ubiquitous, but not everything. Consider Google Maps. Of course, this is a mapping service software, but Google Maps is a physical virtual conglomerate. It involves geographic information systems, satellites and transponders, sensors on cars and rooftops, smartphones, routing systems for data networks, not to mention a small army of human operators at screens who keep the maps up to date worldwide. Wolfram Klingler, an entrepreneur in the finance and fintech sector and a publicist, is far more dangerous. He calls digitalism or religion and the machine a god, whose followers behave just as fanatically as other religious fundamentalists. A small excerpt: when God tests believers through misfortune, fanatics of all religions believe, the solution lies in strengthening faith. Accordingly, for digitalists, problems created by digitalism are easy to solve, through more of the same. More computers, fewer disruptive human beings. A world on autopilot. 200 years after Kant, human beings should finally stop using their underdeveloped minds. Then nothing will stand in the way of the future. A comparison with religions is of course also made by Edward Kaiser when he speaks of devotional attitudes. What escapes all the fanatical followers of digitalization is the ulterior and wicked intention of the dark men and women. Just like the religious bigwigs, with whom they are probably also mostly connected, they are also out to surreptitiously influence Earth humans, to incapacitate them and manipulate them in their own interests. No means is too unsavory for them. Ptaah explained the following to Billy on the 1st of January, 2011, on the occasion of the 512th official contact.
As you wish, but it could be dangerous for you in some ways.
I accept that.
Then I can speak openly. Zafanat Paneach explained again that on Earth a religious sectarian organization is working with a certain secret service to manipulate human beings to their liking via television, computers, and the internet. Not only are the television sets and many monitors manipulated in such a way that the organization can see through them directly into the room and observe and listen in on everything in which the respective set is located, but the computers are also manipulated at will. That alone in relation to the computers means that they can be controlled and interfered with from outside if the organization in question feels like it. But the whole thing goes even further, because the said Secret Service religious sectarian organization also intervenes in and manipulates the lives of all users of television, monitors, and internet devices. This organization, which is protected by every trick in the book by the secret services, has gained entry into the consciousness of human beings throughout the world through the countless manipulated devices and controls their behavior in many areas.
See FIGU Special Bulletin Number 60, April 2011. In seemingly still free, so-called democratic countries, uninitiated followers, that is to say, digitalists, allow themselves to be seduced by sophisticated religion and cult-like practices as experimental objects and thereby fulfill for the dictatorial elites the preliminary stage to the goal of total surveillance and dehumanization of the troublesome foot people. Usually, this promises a reward system, or at least a simplification of life, for system-compliant citizens who switch off their own thinking apparatus and shout pro and hurrah for the rulers. Refusers are not only out of place, but must also be punished in some way. This is how it is planned in China, where citizens are supposed to receive bonus or malus points through good behavior and conformity with the rulers, comparable to the hidden possibilities of the West smart meters, smart watches, smart speakers, etc. Unfortunately, the many insane and insensitive digitalists and other gadget fanatics make it all too easy for the powers behind. Not only by carelessly and mindlessly spreading their also intimate data around the world, but also by immediately brainlessly pouncing on anything touted as awesome and casual by their worshipped gods. In any case, however, the goal of scientists working on artificial intelligence is to create an artificial brain that can also think for itself and is not limited to the automatable intelligence of human beings. According to prophecies and predictions Billy Edward Albert Meyer, Wasser man Zeit Verlag, Figu, this too will become reality one fine day, although it will not yet be today or tomorrow. Contact 251 from the 3rd of February, 1995. In this episode, of course, it cannot fail that new human life forms will be discovered. Extraterrestrials, from whom the Earth humans will learn a great deal and unimagined things, and which are immensely more intelligent than the human beings of Earth itself. This, in turn, will lead to rapid development in all fields, whereby biological intelligences in artificial form will be created, which will be used for the control and handling of all apparatus, devices, electronics and machines, as well as flying and driving machines, etc., in a form in which it need not be feared that the biological intelligences will become independent and pose a danger to the Earth humans. As will be the case with the robot humans, who, as a result, will no longer be needed and will therefore be exterminated. When reading the articles, it is noticeable that the authors, all highly educated, eloquent men, seems to be a male domain, consistently refer to the spirit, although it is often not quite clear what they mean by this. Edward Kaiser, for example, writes, algorithms are problem-solving procedures that can be broken down to small, mindless steps. What is a mindless step? Is it without life? Does it have no consciousness? Or is the mindless step comparable to Wolfram Klingler's sterile bits and bytes when he writes at the end of his article, everything that does not fit into the brave new world of machines must be made to fit on the Procrustean bed of the digitalists, the world of zeros and ones, in order to finally be able to control everything alive in the form of dead and sterile bits and bytes. The scientists of today obviously still have no idea what consciousness is and what merely coarse material brain is. And certainly not what function the mind effectively has, as Billy Edward Albert Meyer explains everything in detail through the teaching of truth, teaching of the mind, teaching of life. See, for example, Free A6 pamphlets. For example, Free A6 booklet, Spirit. What is meant by this term, where it comes from and what it means in the literal sense, etc., Billy Edward Albert Meyer, as well as subtlety of sensations, telepathy, levitation and teleportation, etc., Ptaah. If one wanted to compare a computer with a human brain, then the spirit of the computer would be the power supply. Because the spirit animates the consciousness and thus the whole body, just as the power supply first brings to life or makes the computer run. The spirit also does not think and does not become ill, etc., for such things are reserved for material consciousness alone. Billy Edward Albert Meyer explains spirit briefly as follows. The spirit and thus the spirit energy corresponds to a materially physically impossible ascertainable or measurable and verifiable highly subtle energy, by which everything and anything is animated impulsively, Consequently, nothing exists in the entire universe that would exist without the animating spirit energy. Unfortunately, the knowledge of their creative destiny of the evolution of consciousness was lost to the human beings thousands of years ago. This is the reason why they, in themselves ignorant and groundless, throw themselves believingly at the feet of everyone who suggests the blue of heaven to them with submissive allegiance. If we look at the events whose origin is to be found for the most part in the massively overpopulation of Earth humans, such as the total exploitation of nature, the terrible environmental catastrophes, the floods of refugees, the horrendous environmental pollution, the horrendous destruction and bestial wars, the degenerating terror, the xenophobia, racial and religious hatred, the gnawing hunger and tormenting thirst, the blatantly decreasing compassion among human beings, the unkindness, the unscrupulous greed for wealth, the emotional and psychopathic paranoid behavior, the consciousnesslessness and narrowness, the extreme brutality, the insane religious sectarian fanaticism, the heinous physical and psychological acts of violence, the indifference and lack of conscience and responsibility, and so on, etc. Then one can truly say with Kant, the human being's intellect is underdeveloped. Whereby underdeveloped is, of course, a gross understatement, and what could be more obvious than to supplement the human being with a few artificial components and thereby turn him into a supposed superhuman, a cyborg. Term from English, composed of the terms cybernetic and organism, in German cybernetics, the science of control, and organism. Lovers of the science fiction series Star Trek will surely remember the alien mic called Borg, All the above cries out directly for the answer to the question, what actually is a correct, truthful, and just human being? How does a true human being behave? See also Goblet of the Truth by Billy Edward Albert Meyer, free download at www.figu.org/section 28, sentences 93 to 95. A very simple, global answer to this question could be something like this. A true human being is one who lives according to the creational laws and recommendations and uses his consciousness in a creative way for personal evolution and also for the evolution of fellow human beings. In addition, a detailed answer by Billy Edward Albert Meyer to a reader's question, contact 699 from 13.1. 2018. Question: when can a human being be called righteous? Answer: Billy Edward Albert Meyer. The answer comprises an old-fashioned 33 points, which, however, can be continued at will according to reason and reasonableness. A human being can be called righteous if he fulfills all his duties worthy as a human being, if he cultivates peace and also lives it, when he generously grants freedom to human beings in every way. Fourth, if he rejects all evil, then all unjust and evil, all dishonesty, if he consciously avoids all harm against fellow human beings, the systems of nature and the fauna and flora, if he loves and cultivates all that is good and positive, if he lives in true love, grows and always develops in this respect, if he leads his life in all-round righteousness, if he is free from personal evil, negative and harmful intentions and interests, if he is completely pure in conscience, if he cultivates charity/love for fellow human beings and love for nature and its fauna and flora, if he cultivates a clear and clean conscience, if he is not addicted to material wealth, if he cultivates order and cleanliness in all things, if he lives in a good way according to the creational laws laws and precepts. If he uses his consciousness in a creative way for personal evolution. If he is honorable and dignified in his senses, aspirations and actions and lives these values in this way. If he avoids all destruction of nature and its fauna and flora. If he is helpful in every possible way to his fellow human beings, to nature and its fauna and flora. If he consciously cultivates virtues and also lives them out in every conceivable situation. If he uses the gifts and possibilities of his consciousness for personal and fellow human evolution. If he gives his language a clear, instructive and understandable expression. When he gives honor and dignity to the ineffable beauty of the whole universal creation. When he pays tribute to the full value and grace of all creative treasures and their sublimity. When he consciously expresses his thanks for and cares for his life in a venerable manner. When he contemplatively and honorably appreciates all that is creative as the principal forces of all existence. When he recognizes the creation universe as such and brings all honor and dignity to it. If he is always helpful with regard to the well-being of human beings and all life forms. In spite of possessing many material goods, he does not exalt himself above his fellow men. Full of intellect, reason and logic, he judges and acts upon existing human rights and laws. Despite the power granted to him, he remains responsible, modest, decent and upright. If he enlightens his consciousness with the light and teaching of the truth, spirit and life, if he thinks and lives not according to a belief, but according to creative reality and its truth. In this sense are hidden thousands and thousands of modes of conduct which, when fulfilled, elevate a human being to the status of a true human being. Now how might an efficiency algorithm, that is to say an autopilot for constantly repeating the same or similar processes, make the corresponding human being a true human being? Does it increase his capacity for harmony, peace, love for his neighbor and fellow human beings, for fauna and flora? Does he thereby grant freedom to his fellow men and avoid all dishonesty and all harmful intentions and interests? Does he thereby become more righteous, more helpful, more responsible towards all that is creative? Not at all. The masterminds and financiers behind the often venal scientists have rarely cared about humanity. Every new invention is used primarily to destroy, and so it will be no different this time. The more neurological knowledge advances, the more dangerous it becomes for the ordinary citizens of a country. The lust for power and the miserable mindset of the ruling elites will make them dictatorial over the weal and woe of their people, leading to untold suffering. Centuries, if not millennia, will slip away into the past until the majority of human beings change their minds and a better time will come. But still, such a small micromodule that would help to increase the ability to concentrate in some other processes of consciousness would be quite nice and helpful. Conclusion: anyone who still has a vestige of intellect and reason should defend themselves against the appropriation and expropriation of their body and brain. Especially not should human beings voluntarily, for fun and because it is so cool, make themselves available as an automation and control factor and allow their thoughts, feelings, and memory to be manipulated by evildoers. Marianne Ollinger, Switzerland.
I will.
Then I have some things to discuss with you now, but we do not want to do it in an official way.